Harlem Renaissance. What was the Harlem Renaissance? The Harlem Renaissance was an artistic movement centered around the breaking of African American stereotypes using literature, music, visual arts, and fashion. This artistic movement happened after World War I, starting off with mostly literature with memories of the reconstruction of the nation after the Civil War. Many of the topics that were in the writings made in this time period were those speaking of slavery, institutionalized racism, bringing African culture into modern Black life, and day-to-day experiences for a Black person in the urban North. Many Black poets and writers wanted to tie in their African ancestry to their writing, which led to the creation of jazz poetry. The immense amount of Southern Black people moving to the North changed the stereotype of African Americans being dull, dirty peasants to being sophisticated, classy, and creative souls. This change of social appearance allowed so many more Black people to be seen by the world and changed Black Americans forever. Not only was this time period for Blacks an acceptance of all writing choices, political opinions, fashion statements, and art styles, it was also the beginning of the acceptance of the Black LGBTQ+ community. Henry Louis Gates Jr. once said the Harlem Renaissance was surely as gay as it was Black. This movement changed the perception of Black people in America in a positive light. When was the Harlem Renaissance? The Harlem Renaissance started at the end of World War I in the year of 1917. In 1917, 3 different progressive Black plays were premiered, which was the beginning of the movement that would change the lives of Black Americans forever. This movement survived throughout all of the 1920s and made it through the 1930s. Sadly, the Great Depression caused many well-known supporters of the movement to move for work or shut down business. The Harlem Renaissance ended in 1937. How did the Harlem Renaissance happen? The start of the Harlem Renaissance was the premiere of 3 plays in 1917, all of which had Black characters that broke stereotypes and were portrayed with emotional depth. If We Must Die, a groundbreaking sonnet written by Claude McKay in 1919, was one of the first heavily political literary arts made in this time period. His sonnet was about African culture and modern urban life. Religion, mostly Christianity, was a huge part of the Harlem Renaissance. This inspired many poets and writers to preach about the hardships they go through just because of how they want to practice their religion. Many types of religion were worshipped and widely accepted by those who supported the Harlem Renaissance, but that wasn't the only part that was accepted. Different practices such as voodoo and Santeria were practiced by many Black people who wanted to keep in touch with their African ancestry through spiritual means. Although your religion would be accepted by most, this era also encouraged people's thoughts and critiques on religion and its practices. Musical arts were also able to blur the lines between the poor and wealthy Black people in society. They did this by creating what was called Harlem Stride style. This was a combination between brass instruments commonly used in jazz and usually correlated with lower classes, and the piano, usually correlated with wealth and higher classes. Not only did music change, but so did fashion. Where there were once short skirts and stockings, there were now long loose dresses and pearl necklaces. This was the time of feather boas, crochet hats, and cigarettes. Men also got to enjoy the new fashion trends, wearing loose suits known as zoots, white gloves, wide-brimmed hats, and Chesterfield coats. The goal was to change the style to represent elegance, but also flamboyancy. The fashion was also styled around the dancing style of that time. Who were the people who contributed to the Harlem Renaissance? Many people part of the Harlem Renaissance were either a part of the Great Migration or were from the Caribbean desperately looking for a better life. Harlem was where people united. Specific people that were important to the Harlem Renaissance were Claude McKay and James Weldon Johnson, whose writing represented the lives of African Americans in America. Musical performers who helped the progression of the movement were U.B. Blake, Florence Mills, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Fletcher Henderson, all of which were musicians in jazz. Josephine Baker was not only an actress, but she also helped change the fashion industry. Ethel Moses was also an actress at the time, who is well known for her bob haircut. Not only did people help this cause, but many newspapers, including The Crisis, The Messenger, and Opportunity, helped advance important information about the Harlem Renaissance to people around the country. Where was the Harlem Renaissance? Harlem, Massachusetts, New York was a district originally made from high-class, wealthy white citizens. Because of this, the houses and buildings were grand houses with impressive amenities, but the high amount of buildings caused many landlords scouring for someone to rent their property. This eventually caused the place to be abandoned as all the wealthy whites were moving farther north. This district soon became the home of many middle-class African Americans in the early 1900s. Soon more African Americans were moving to the neighborhood, which would soon start a historic movement. Why did the Harlem Renaissance happen? This movement was a way for all African Americans to come together with the use of all forms of art to prove their humanity and the need for equality to everyone who would listen. This movement allowed acceptance to all, from writers to designers to the LGBTQ+ community. This was meant to show everyone that you have the courage inside you to show your true selves without feeling shame. The Harlem Renaissance gave a voice to the voiceless and opportunities to those who would have never had these types of opportunities before. And this is the works cited page.